A peaceful afternoon in the park. A man sits alone on a bench, enjoying the quiet, until a police officer approaches. What starts as a simple interaction quickly takes an unexpected turn. Tension rises, power is tested, and in just a few moments, everything will change. Stay tuned to witness a moment that no one saw coming. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Also, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. The golden rays of the late afternoon sun filtered through the towering oak and maple trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the park. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, mingling with the distant sounds of laughter, the rhythmic chirping of birds, and the occasional rustling of leaves. Joggers padded along the winding trails, their steady footsteps blending with the natural symphony of the park. Families lounged on blankets, sharing quiet conversations and snacks, while children squealed with joy near the playground. Dogs chased frisbees, their enthusiastic barks punctuating the otherwise serene atmosphere. Cyclists glided smoothly along the paths, their bells ringing occasionally as they maneuvered around pedestrians. Near an old, weathered oak tree, a wooden bench stood alone. The paint on its surface had long since faded, worn down by years of sun and rain. Upon it sat a man whose presence was unassuming yet quietly commanding, as though he had always belonged there. He exuded an air of ease and stillness, one hand resting casually on the back of the bench, the other holding a small bottle of water. His expression was unreadable, neither welcoming nor distant, as he observed the park around him with a calm, practiced gaze. Sitting there, Sly Stallone appeared like any other man enjoying a peaceful moment, yet there was something about him, an intangible weight that surrounded him like an aura. His face, chiseled with years of experience, bore the unmistakable lines of a man who had seen both victory and hardship. His muscular frame, concealed beneath a simple gray hoodie and athletic pants, hinted at a lifetime of discipline. His presence was solid, unshakable, yet it carried no arrogance. Instead, it was the kind of presence that came from a man who had nothing to prove. He broke a piece of protein bar in his hand, tossing small crumbs at his feet. A group of pigeons quickly gathered, bobbing their heads as they pecked at the offerings. He watched them in silence, his breathing steady, his mind absent of worry. Across the park, the rhythmic, deliberate thud of polished boots striking pavement disrupted the gentle harmony. The sound carried with it an air of authority, a sharp contrast to the relaxed cadence of the park's usual inhabitants. Each step was measured, controlled, exuding an expectation of obedience. It was the stride of a man who had spent years ensuring that others recognized and responded to his presence. Officer Brent Carlisle, a towering figure in his meticulously pressed LAPD uniform, moved through the park like a wolf surveying its domain. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the world in cold, impersonal fragments, masking the sharp, appraising eyes beneath them. The utility belt strapped securely around his waist carried the polished instruments of his authority: a baton, handcuffs, a taser, and his standard-issue firearm. Each tool clinked faintly with his movement, an audible reminder of his power. His face, square-jawed and hardened by years on the force, bore the expression of a man who believed respect was not given but taken. Carlisle was not a man known for patience or kindness. His reputation preceded him among those who frequented this part of the city. He was not simply a keeper of order, but an enforcer of his own brand of control. People learned quickly that challenging him brought swift consequences, and those who failed to recognize the boundaries he set rarely forgot their mistake. As he patrolled the park, his eyes scanned over the crowds, categorizing the people within moments: joggers, families, teenagers, dog walkers. Harmless. Nothing worth his attention. Then his gaze landed on the man sitting alone on the bench. Something about him unsettled Carlyle. He wasn't doing anything unlawful, but his stillness, his calm, seemed out of place. He wasn't jogging. He wasn't picnicking. He wasn't playing with a dog or entertaining a child. He was simply sitting, watching, breathing. That alone was enough to put Carlyle on edge. In his experience, people who lingered in public spaces without an obvious purpose were either loiterers or troublemakers, sometimes both. There was a certain self-assurance in the way this man occupied the bench, a quiet certainty that Carlyle found irritating. He had encountered types like this before. Men who didn't flinch, who didn't scramble to explain themselves, who thought authority was something that applied only to others. Carlyle enjoyed correcting those kinds of people. It was, in his eyes, a public service. Veering off the main path, he adjusted his course, his boots striking the pavement with deliberate intent. His right hand brushed against the handle of his baton, a subconscious habit rather than a necessity. He didn't expect trouble, but he never hesitated when an opportunity arose to assert his presence. Around them, the park continued its peaceful rhythms. A woman walking her dog slowed her pace, glancing between the officer and the solitary man on the bench. A group of teenagers playing catch exchanged quick, knowing looks. They had seen Carlyle work before. The officer came to a stop, his imposing shadow falling over Stallone. He planted his feet wide, his hands resting on his belt, radiating the quiet intimidation that demanded immediate compliance. The pigeons at Stallone's feet scattered at the officer's arrival, their wings flapping in a burst of startled motion. Stallone remained still. He did not shift, did not adjust his posture. He did not acknowledge Carlyle's presence, nor did he appear to be ignoring him. He simply existed, unbothered by the shift in atmosphere. Carlyle's jaw tightened. He was used to people reacting to his presence, nervous shifts, immediate explanations, submissive compliance. But this man did nothing. No recognition, no apology, no obedience. The air between them thickened. The surrounding sounds of the park seemed to dull under the invisible weight of the moment. A single breath stretched between them, suspended in quiet expectation. Carlyle inhaled slowly, his nostrils flaring as he suppressed the wave of irritation bubbling beneath his skin. This was the part where most people realized who they were dealing with and adjusted accordingly. But the man remained as he was, as if Carlyle was of no consequence. The silence would not last. Carlyle's patience was a brittle thing, worn thin by years of dealing with people who needed to be reminded of their place, the fact that the man before him hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged his presence, gnawed at him. His authority was an unspoken command, an expectation ingrained in his interactions. But this man, this calm, unmoving figure, was treating him as though he were nothing more than a passing breeze. It was unacceptable. Carlyle took a step closer, his polished boots grinding subtly against the pavement. The movement sent a clear message. This was not a casual encounter. His fingers flexed once against his belt, brushing the baton's handle again, not as a threat, but as an anchor. "You got a problem, buddy?" His voice was flat, the kind that cut through the soft hum of the park and demanded an answer. Slowly, Stallone turned his head, finally shifting his gaze up to the officer. His expression was unreadable, neither amused nor annoyed, simply observing. His eyes, sharp and knowing, locked onto Carlyle's face. "No problem," he said, his voice low, even. Carlyle waited for more, an explanation, an excuse, something that would fit neatly into the dynamic he was used to. But Stallone simply held his gaze, his posture unchanged. "You got ID on you?" A pause. "Did I do something wrong?" Carlyle exhaled slowly through his nose, his irritation sharpening. This was a game. He knew it. The man knew it. It was the same old back and forth that happened when someone wanted to test his patience. It never ended well for them. "I asked you a question," Carlyle said, his voice hardening. "And I asked you one," Stallone replied, still calm, still collected. A quiet murmur spread through the handful of onlookers nearby. Nothing obvious, no overt gawking, but the subtle tension in the air had caught their attention. A couple of teenagers had stopped their game of catch. A woman with a dog lingered, pretending to adjust the leash. People recognized the shift before they even understood it. Carlyle squared his stance, planting his feet firmer. His fingers tapped once on his belt. "You're in a public park, sitting alone, no visible purpose. That's enough reason for me to ask," he said. "Now, ID, let's see it." Stallone took another deliberate pause, then slowly reached into his hoodie pocket. Carlyle's body tensed automatically. His hand moved instinctively closer to his baton. But Stallone didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he retrieved a small bottle of water. With the same slow precision, he twisted off the cap, took a sip, then set the bottle down beside him. Carlyle's jaw clenched. It wasn't just the lack of fear, it was the absolute indifference. "You're ignoring a direct order from law enforcement," Carlyle said, his voice lower now, edged with something colder. "No," Stallone corrected. "I'm sitting on a bench, minding my own business." Carlyle's fingers wrapped around the handle of his baton. A small movement, but a deliberate one. The air between them thickened, charged with something more than just words. The park, though still bustling with life, felt muted, as if the earth itself was waiting to see what would happen next. A jogger who had been approaching suddenly changed direction, cutting across the grass. The woman with the dog took a cautious step back. The teenagers no longer pretended to be distracted. Everyone who had seen Carlyle in action before knew that a line was about to be crossed. The tension between the two men hung heavy. Stallone still hadn't moved beyond that simple sip of water, but his gaze had not wavered. There was no challenge in his eyes, only patience. A patience that grated against every instinct Carlyle had. He didn't like being made to feel small. He didn't like people who thought they were above the rules. Carlyle's grip on the baton tightened. This would be over in a second. Carlyle's grip on the baton tightened further, the tension in his fingers turning his knuckles white. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, and he was done waiting for compliance. The man sitting before him, unmoving and indifferent, had pushed past the point of tolerance. Carlyle was not a man who enjoyed being tested. He was a man who enforced order, and right now this was a disruption he intended to correct. His instincts, honed through years of asserting dominance, dictated his next move. Without another word, without waiting for an escalation beyond this unbearable defiance, he moved. The baton arced downward in a sharp, controlled strike, aimed at Stallone's shoulder. It was not meant to maim, just to send a message. The whisper of air cutting around the weapon was the only warning before impact. But the impact never came. In the blink of an eye, Stallone moved. Not hastily, not with panic, but with the precise grace of someone who had lived in the world of violence long enough to anticipate it before it arrived. His body shifted just enough that the baton whistled past him, striking the wooden bench instead. The sharp crack of impact echoed across the clearing, sending a splinter flying from the battered wood. Carlyle barely had time to register the miss before he adjusted, twisting his wrist to redirect the weapon. His reaction was fast, years of training and muscle memory kicking in as he launched a second strike, this time aimed lower toward the side of Stallone's torso. But before the baton could complete its path, something happened that stopped everything. A single hand shot up steady and controlled, closing around the baton's shaft with effortless precision. The movement was so fluid, so certain, that for a brief second Carlyle's mind refused to process what had just happened. The baton was no longer his. It had not been torn away, nor ripped from his grip. It had simply been stopped, taken, as though he had never been holding it to begin with. Silence followed, an unbearable silence that stretched across the park like a taut wire. The crowd that had gathered now stood frozen. The teenagers, who had been watching from a distance, no longer whispered among themselves. The woman with the dog had taken another step back, her fingers tightening around the leash. Phones had been raised, small glowing screens capturing every second of the unfolding moment. Carlyle's heart pounded. His fingers, still wrapped around the baton's handle, tried to pull back, to wrench it free, but it did not move. Stallone's grip was solid, unshakable. It wasn't the grip of a man who was struggling or fighting. It was the grip of a man who simply had control. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, a flicker of uncertainty passed through Carlyle's chest. A single, undeniable realization settled into his gut. He had made a mistake. His pride, however, refused to let him accept it. His instincts screamed at him to regain control. He yanked again, harder this time, but it was useless. Instead, Stallone's wrist turned, not violently, not forcefully, but with a slow and deliberate motion that carried an undeniable finality. Carlyle felt the unnatural angle of his own wrist twist in protest, his muscles resisting the movement, but it was already too late. The baton was slipping from his grasp. Then it was gone. The polished black shaft hit the ground between them with a hollow clatter, rolling once before settling on the pavement. The sound, though small, carried an immeasurable weight. The silence deepened. Carlyle's chest rose and fell in a sharp rhythm, his breath short and uneven. His mind scrambled for the next move, the next action to reclaim what had just been stripped from him in full view of witnesses. His authority, his control had been unraveled in a matter of seconds, and now all eyes were on him. He could feel them, the crowd, the judgment, the cameras. His face burned hot, the pulse in his neck a hammering beat of rage and disbelief. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had struck first, he had escalated, and yet he had failed. And the worst part, the absolute unbearable truth, was that the man in front of him had not even stood up, had not fought back, had not needed to. Stallone, still seated, did nothing more than release the baton from his fingers, letting it fall as if discarding something insignificant, something beneath him. There was no smirk, no taunt, no sign of amusement or arrogance. There was nothing in his expression except quiet, unwavering composure. Carlyle's breath was ragged, his vision narrowing in on the only thing that could possibly salvage this moment. His belt held more than just a baton. It held the one thing that could reestablish the hierarchy, that could force compliance, that could bring an end to this humiliation. His fingers twitched once before brushing the cold, familiar weight of his service weapon. And in that moment, the entire park seemed to hold its breath. Carlyle's fingers hovered over the grip of his service weapon, his body vibrating with the desperate need to reclaim control. The unbearable weight of humiliation pressed against his chest, tightening his breath, clouding his judgment. The baton lay discarded between them, a symbol of his failure. But the gun could change everything. One motion, one swift action, and he could turn the tide back in his favor. He wasn't thinking of consequences. He wasn't thinking of cameras, of witnesses, of the eyes burning into him from all directions. He was thinking only of dominance, of restoring the power that had so quickly slipped through his fingers. He moved, but he never completed the draw. In the span of a breath, Stallone's hand was already on him. Not in aggression, not in force, just a movement so precise, so controlled that it felt inevitable. The moment Carlyle's fingers closed around the handle of his gun, Stallone's grip locked onto his wrist with effortless precision. It was not violent. It was not rushed. It was simply final. Carlyle's muscles tensed as he tried to pull back, to reclaim his authority, but it was no use. His wrist, the same wrist that had lost the baton, was now trapped again. His fingers, once so certain, now felt weak, his grip slipping against the cold metal of the weapon. His mind screamed at him to act, to fight, to do something, but his body was already betraying him. And then it was gone. The gun was no longer in his hand. The shift was so fluid, so seamless, that for a full second, Carlyle couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He had not felt it being wrenched away. He had not felt the usual resistance of a struggle. It had simply ceased to be his. The world around them seemed to pause. The murmurs of the crowd, once a quiet hum, now swelled into something sharper, more pronounced. People who had hesitated to record before now lifted their phones with urgency, their screens capturing the impossible. The impossible being that a trained officer of the law had just been disarmed with no more than a single motion. Stallone did not raise the weapon. He did not point it. He did not use it to assert dominance in return. Instead, he merely turned it in his hand, examining its weight with idle curiosity, as if the object held no meaning to him. Then, with the same slow deliberation that had defined his every action, he bent his knees, lowered the gun, and placed it neatly on the ground beside the fallen baton. The soft, metallic clink as it touched the pavement was barely audible, but it rang louder than any gunshot could have. Carlyle's breath came in short, uneven bursts. His arm tingled from the sudden loss of leverage, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning inside him. His face, already flushed with anger, now darkened with something closer to shame. His body screamed for retaliation, for some way to salvage what had just been taken from him. But his options had dwindled to nothing. The crowd knew it. The park knew it. And, worst of all, Stallone knew it. Still, the man did not gloat, did not revel in the moment, did not use his advantage to humiliate further. He simply straightened, returned his hands to his lap, and resumed his seat. As if nothing had happened, as if Carlyle had never even been a factor in his day, and that, more than anything, was what sent Carlyle's pride spiraling into fury. A low, sharp chuckle came from somewhere in the gathered crowd. The sound cut through the silence like a blade, and Carlyle's head snapped toward it. The humiliation was real. It was growing, and it was being recorded from every possible angle. His failure was no longer confined to this moment. It was immortalized. His heart pounded so hard against his ribs that he could barely think. His hands twitched at his sides, useless now that his tools of power lay abandoned at his feet. The weight of the stairs around him felt suffocating, but the worst was the stillness. Stallone's stillness. The complete and utter dismissal of his presence. Carlyle had never felt smaller in his life. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he searched for an answer, any answer, to reclaim authority. The gun was gone. The baton was gone. But there was still one thing left, one last resort. He lifted his radio, his fingers gripping the device with the force of desperation. His voice, when it came, was hoarse but loud. "Officer needs assistance. Immediate backup requested." The word carried through the humid air, cutting through the whispers and murmurs like a siren's wail. And then, somewhere in the distance, real sirens began to howl. The rising wail of sirens cut through the summer air, growing louder with each passing second. The park, once filled with the lazy hum of laughter and conversation, had shifted into something tense, something watchful. Every person who had witnessed what had just unfolded knew that the situation had changed. The confrontation was no longer between two men. It was now something larger, something far more dangerous. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present, an invisible force that seemed to still the very air around them. Carlyle remained frozen where he stood, his chest rising and falling in sharp, ragged breaths. His hands hung uselessly at his sides, fingers twitching with the leftover remnants of adrenaline and humiliation. He had lost his baton. He had lost his gun. And now he had lost the last shreds of control he thought he had. But the sirens, they were his last chance. His last hope to turn this narrative back in his favor. Backup meant authority. It meant reinforcements. It meant someone to take his side before this moment spiraled further out of his grasp. Stallone had not moved. He remained seated, composed, as if the chaos unfolding around him was of no consequence. His eyes flicked once toward the sound of the approaching sirens, but there was no tension in his body, no indication that he was preparing to flee. If anything, he looked almost bored, as if he had seen this kind of scenario play out too many times before to be surprised by it now. The first police cruiser screeched to a stop at the edge of the park, its tires kicking up a small spray of dust from the pavement. Within seconds, the doors flew open, and two officers emerged. One was young, taut with readiness, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. The other was older, seasoned, his face carved with lines that spoke of years spent making decisions with lasting consequences. His eyes scanned the scene with practiced efficiency, assessing everything before he even spoke. Carlyle took a step forward, his body still pulsing with the need to take back control. His voice, raw with frustration, cut through the thickening air. "He assaulted an officer. He disarmed me." The younger officer reacted immediately, snapping his gaze toward Stallone, his posture tightening with alertness, his fingers flexed near his belt, ready for action. But before he could take a step, the older officer lifted a hand, a silent command that halted him in place. "Wait," the older officer said, his voice calm but weighted with authority. His eyes moved from Carlyle to the baton and the gun on the ground. He looked at Stallone, who still hadn't moved. Then he looked back at Carlyle. Carlyle's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew what was happening. The older officer was piecing things together, and it wasn't leading to the conclusion Carlyle wanted. His jaw clenched. "You saw what I saw," Carlyle pressed. I saw enough," the older officer interrupted, his tone still even, still unreadable. Carlyle's stomach twisted. The older officer exhaled slowly through his nose, then took a measured step forward, closer to the discarded weapons on the ground. His eyes flicked to the crowd, to the raised chiffons capturing every second, and then back to Carlyle. And then he spoke. "Give me your badge." The words fell like a hammer, shattering whatever fragile grip Carlyle had left on the situation. His throat went dry. "What?" The older officer didn't repeat himself. He simply extended his hand, palm up, waiting. Carlyle's entire body tensed. The moment stretched unbearably long, the air growing heavier with each passing second. The younger officer shifted awkwardly beside him, unsure of where to look, his fingers no longer near his weapon. The crowd, now realizing the full weight of what was happening, had fallen into a thick, waiting silence. Carlyle's breath hitched in his throat. His mind scrambled for an argument, for something, anything, that could change this outcome. He had been the one attacked. He had been the one disarmed. He had been the one who called for backup. But the judgment in the older officer's eyes told him that none of that mattered anymore. The moment the baton left his hands, the moment his gun was taken, the moment he lost control, it had already been decided. Slowly, his fingers rose to his chest, his hand shaken as it found the cold metal of his badge. It felt heavier than it ever had before. A symbol of power, a symbol of authority, a symbol of everything that had just been stripped from him. He unpinned it. The small piece of metal caught the light, reflecting the last of the setting sun's golden rays as he hesitated, holding on to it for just a fraction longer than necessary. But there was no way out of this, no escape from the weight of the truth. With a final, reluctant motion, he placed the badge into the older officer's waiting palm. The older officer closed his fingers around it, then nodded once. "Now the gun." Carlyle's stomach twisted harder. His pride, raw, burning, unbearable, screamed at him to resist. But what choice did he have? His hand dropped to his belt, unbuckled the holster, and pulled the gun free. But this time, when he handed it over, there was no hesitation. The moment it left his grip, he felt the weight of his career, his authority, his identity crumble into dust. The park, the world itself, seemed to exhale. The older officer nodded once more, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Stallone. "Would you be willing to stay and make a statement?" Stallone's expression remained neutral, his posture as relaxed as ever. He let a beat of silence pass before he gave a single nod. A quiet murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, a mixture of disbelief, awe, and quiet understanding. Carlyle could hear none of it. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat, the deafening roar of his own downfall. Carlyle stood motionless, his fingers clenching and unclenching at his sides as the weight of what had just happened settled over him like a suffocating fog. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. His authority, stripped from him in a matter of moments, had been reduced to nothing more than a hollow memory. The burning heat of humiliation crawled under his skin, hotter than the sun that had begun its slow descent behind the trees. The world felt unsteady beneath his feet, the ground itself betraying him as his body screamed for action, for some way to fix this, to claw back what had been taken from him. But there was no fixing this. He could feel their eyes on him, the judgment in every gaze and every phone screen that remained raised, recording every painful second of his downfall. He knew how this would end. The videos would spread. His name would be dragged through headlines, through whispers, through every conversation that would reduce him to nothing more than an officer who had been overpowered, outmatched, and exposed for the weakness he had tried to hide behind a badge. And worst of all, Stallone had done nothing more than exist. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't fought. He hadn't even raised his voice. Yet, in doing nothing, he had dismantled everything Carlyle had built his identity upon. The older officer still held his badge and gun, his expression unreadable as he gave a small nod toward the younger officer, signaling him to take control of the situation. The younger officer hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward toward Stallone, his posture cautious but lacking the tension that Carlyle had carried from the beginning. "Sir," the younger officer said, his voice careful, measured, "are you all right?" Stallone finally moved, the first real shift in his posture since the entire ordeal had begun. He exhaled, slow and steady, before nodding once. There was no gloating in his expression, no arrogance, just the quiet certainty of a man who had long since learned that true power did not need to be proven. The younger officer glanced down at the discarded baton and gun, then back at Stallone. "Would you be willing to stay a moment and give a statement?" For the first time, Stallone's gaze flickered, moving toward the crowd that had not yet dispersed, toward the rows of cameras that had captured every detail, every second. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in the way he looked at them, something that spoke of a weariness, of a man who had seen too many moments like this unfold. He gave another small nod, a simple acknowledgement. The tension in the air shifted. A collective breath was released as the moment transitioned from something electric to something inevitable. The crowd, sensing that the climax had passed, began to break apart. Some turned away, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others lingered, whispering among themselves, their voices carrying the weight of what they had just witnessed. A few hesitated, still holding their phones up, uncertain if the moment was truly over. Carlyle barely noticed any of it. His mind was a haze of static, his pulse a relentless pounding in his ears. He wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, anything to erase the last 20 minutes of his life. But there was nothing left. The decision had been made. His fate had been sealed. And then came the final blow. The older officer turned back toward him, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. "Go home, Dan." The words cut deeper than anything else that had happened. Carlyle flinched, barely, but enough that it could be seen. His mouth opened as if he was going to protest, but the look in the older officer's eyes stopped him. There was no room for argument, no room for anything. It was over. With slow, stiff movements, Carlyle turned. His feet felt heavy as he forced himself to walk, step by step, away from the clearing, away from the eyes that bore into his back, away from the moment that had unraveled everything he had built. He didn't look at Stallone. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras, because he knew what he would see, and he couldn't bear to face it. His boots hit the pavement, carrying him further away, but the weight of the day, of the moment, of his own actions would follow him long after he had disappeared from sight. The park began to settle as the tension that had gripped it slowly unraveled. The murmurs of the crowd softened. Footsteps shuffled against the pavement as people started to drift away, conversations hushed but heavy with meaning. The spectacle was over, but the weight of what had happened lingered like an imprint on the earth itself. The world had witnessed something that could not be undone. Stallone remained seated, unmoved by the commotion around him. His breathing was steady, his expression unreadable. He watched without watching as Carlyle's figure shrank into the distance, his steps rigid, his shoulders stiff with the weight of disgrace. The man had come here expecting compliance, expecting control, expecting to enforce his authority the way he always had. Instead, he had walked away with nothing. No badge, no gun, no power. The older officer exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face as he turned his gaze back to Stallone. He studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide what to say, what words could possibly add meaning to what had already played out so clearly. Finally, he gave a small nod. "No charges?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew the answer. Stallone met his gaze, his expression calm, unwavering. He shook his head once. "He's had enough." The officer nodded again, his lips pressing into a thin line. It was not gratitude that flickered in his expression, nor approval, but perhaps understanding. He had been on the force long enough to recognize moments like these, moments where justice did not come from paperwork or courtrooms, but from something quieter, something deeper. "Understood," he said simply. With nothing more to say, the officer turned away, motioning for the younger officer to begin gathering the scene, to clear away the remnants of what had transpired. The baton and gun were collected, the radio static hummed with brief updates, but none of it mattered. The real resolution had already taken place. Stallone exhaled, his shoulders rolling back slightly as if releasing the last bit of tension from his muscles. He pushed himself up from the bench, his movements slow, unhurried. The pigeons that had scattered earlier began to return, pecking at the last crumbs he had left behind, oblivious to the weight of the events that had unfolded around them. He took one last look around the park, his gaze sweeping over the paths, the trees, the fading glow of the sun dipping lower beyond the skyline. The world had already begun moving on. People returned to their picnics, to their jogs, to their conversations, some with lingering glances toward the empty space where Carlyle had stood, but most letting it fade into memory. He adjusted his hoodie, took a slow sip from his water bottle, and then, without another word, he walked away. There was nothing left to prove. Behind him, the park continued as it always had, as it always would. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, the rustling leaves whispered in the warm evening air, and life went on, carrying with it the silent understanding that power, real power, was never about force. It was about presence, about knowing when to stand, when to move, and when to let the world speak for itself. And as the sun set, casting long golden shadows across the pavement, the truth remained. Power could be taken, authority could be stripped away. But respect was earned, and some men would never understand that. A moment of silence, a lesson learned, and a reminder that true power doesn't come from force, it comes from respect. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button and subscribe for more gripping content. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.